The summer evening started like any other for Mike Chen, a 32-year-old auto mechanic from the quiet suburbs of Sacramento. He was driving home from his late shift at the garage, taking his usual route along the dimly lit County Road 23. The radio hummed softly, playing old country songs as he thought about the simple dinner waiting for him at home. Little did Mike know that this ordinary Thursday would become the night that changed not just his life, but the lives of many others in ways he could never have imagined. The clock on his dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when he noticed the first signs of trouble ahead. Through the darkness, he spotted an unusual glow in the distance. At first, he thought it might be construction work. They'd been fixing that stretch of road for weeks. But as he drew closer, his heart began to race. The glow wasn't from construction lights. It was flames. A police cruiser had veered off the road and crashed into a large oak tree. Smoke poured from under the crumpled hood, and angry orange flames were beginning to lick at the front of the vehicle. Mike's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled over, his work boots hitting the gravel before his mind could even process what he was doing. The heat from the growing fire hit his face as he ran toward the wreck. Through the driver's side window, he could see an unconscious officer slumped over the steering wheel. The airbag had deployed, but the impact had been severe enough to knock him out cold. The flames were spreading fast, and Mike knew they didn't have much time. He grabbed the door handle, burning his palm in the process, but the door was jammed. The crash had twisted the frame, sealing the officer inside what was quickly becoming a death trap. Mike's mind raced back to his years working in his father's garage, remembering all the times they'd dealt with crashed vehicles. There had to be a way in. Running back to his truck, Mike grabbed his trusty tire iron, the same one he'd used earlier that day to help Mrs. Rodriguez with her flat tire. The next few moments would later become a blur in his memory, but witnesses who stopped to help would later describe how he never hesitated. With the precision of someone who'd spent his life working with cars, Mike broke the passenger side window, the one furthest from the flames. The sound of shattering glass mixed with the crackling of the fire as he cleared the frame. The smoke was getting thicker now, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. Mike reached across the passenger seat, fighting against the heat and smoke. His hands found the officer's duty belt, and he began pulling with all his strength. The officer was a big man, easily over 6 feet tall, and the awkward angle made it nearly impossible to get leverage. Just then, another explosion rocked the vehicle as something in the engine compartment caught fire. The heat became unbearable, and Mike could feel his clothes beginning to singe. But he couldn't let go. Not now. Not when he was so close. With one final surge of desperate strength, Mike managed to pull the officer free through the passenger window. Together, they tumbled onto the pavement, rolling away from the burning wreck. Just in time, moments later, the entire vehicle was engulfed in flames. As other drivers stopped to help and someone called 911, Mike stayed with the unconscious officer, checking his pulse and making sure he was breathing. The officer's name tag read, Officer R. Singh. Mike talked to him continuously, even though he wasn't sure if Officer Singh could hear him, telling him help was coming and everything would be okay. It wasn't until the ambulances and fire trucks arrived that Mike noticed the burns on his arms and hands. The adrenaline had masked the pain, but now it was starting to set in. The paramedics insisted on checking him out, despite his protests that he was fine. As they loaded Officer Singh into the ambulance, Mike caught a glimpse of his face in the flashing emergency lights. The officer's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting Mike's gaze. There was a moment of recognition, of profound connection between two strangers whose lives had become inexplicably intertwined. What Mike didn't know then was that Officer Raj Singh wasn't just any police officer. He was a beloved figure in the community, a 15-year veteran of the force who had touched countless lives through his work with at-risk youth. He was a father of 3, a Little League coach, and the primary caregiver for his elderly parents. The local news crews arrived just as Mike was finishing up with the paramedics. He tried to slip away quietly. He'd never been comfortable in the spotlight, but a young reporter caught him before he could leave. When she asked him why he'd risked his life to save a stranger, Mike's answer was simple and straightforward: "I just did what anyone would do. When someone needs help, you help them." But as Mike drove home that night, his bandaged hands gripping the steering wheel, he had no idea that this modest response would soon become part of a much bigger story. The dashcam footage from Officer Singh's cruiser had captured the entire rescue, and by morning, it would begin spreading across social media like wildfire. The first part of Mike's journey was coming to an end, but the real story, the one that would touch hearts across the country and inspire a movement of everyday heroes, was just beginning. As he finally pulled into his driveway at 2 a.m., exhausted and still smelling of smoke, Mike Chen was still just a mechanic who'd done what he thought was right. He didn't know that by this time tomorrow, his phone would be ringing off the hook, his simple act of courage about to spark a chain of events that would change not just his life, but his entire community. His wife Lisa was waiting up for him, worried sick after he hadn't answered his phone. As he told her what happened, her eyes filling with tears of pride and concern, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in the universe. He just didn't know what it was yet. The next morning, Mike woke up to his phone buzzing non-stop. The dashcam footage had gone viral overnight, reaching millions of views across multiple social media platforms. Local news stations were camped outside his modest two-story home, and his work voicemail was full of interview requests from national media outlets. Lisa brought him coffee as he sat at their kitchen table, trying to process it all. Their quiet life had suddenly become the center of attention, and Mike, who'd spent his whole life fixing cars and keeping to himself, wasn't sure how to handle it. His hands still stung from the burns, a constant reminder of the previous night's events. Meanwhile, at Sacramento General Hospital, Officer Singh was recovering in the intensive care unit. The crash had left him with a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and smoke inhalation injuries, but doctors were optimistic about his recovery. His family had been by his side since the moment they got the call, and the hospital corridor was filled with fellow officers keeping vigil. The story of Mike's rescue had spread through the police department like wildfire. Officers who'd watched the dashcam footage were moved to tears by the mechanic's selfless actions. The police chief himself had visited Officer Singh's family, sharing the video with them. Mrs. Singh, watching the footage of Mike pulling her husband from the burning car, couldn't stop crying, repeatedly asking to meet the man who'd saved her children's father. Back at Mike's auto shop, his co-workers were fielding countless calls. Regular customers were sharing stories about Mike's everyday kindness, how he'd stayed late to fix a single mom's car so she wouldn't miss work, or the time he'd helped a stranded elderly couple during a rainstorm without charging them a penny. These small acts of kindness, which Mike had always considered just part of being a decent human being, were now being shared alongside his heroic rescue. By midday, the story had caught the attention of national news networks. The dashcam footage played on repeat, Mike's truck pulling over, his sprint to the burning vehicle, the desperate struggle to free Officer Singh, and their final roll to safety moments before the car was engulfed in flames. Social media was flooded with comments from people inspired by his courage, calling him a real-life hero and an everyday angel. But what touched people most was learning about both men's backgrounds. Officer Singh had spent years building bridges between the police department and the local immigrant community. He'd started a youth mentoring program that had helped dozens of teenagers stay in school and out of trouble. His accident had occurred while returning from a late-night community meeting where he'd been working on organizing a neighborhood watch program. Mike's own story resonated just as deeply. The son of Chinese immigrants, he'd taken over his father's auto shop after his dad suffered a stroke 5 years ago. He'd maintained the shop's reputation for honest work and fair prices, often helping people who couldn't afford repairs. His wife Lisa worked as an elementary school teacher, and together they volunteered at the local food bank on weekends. That afternoon, Mike finally agreed to visit Officer Singh in the hospital. The corridors fell silent as he walked through, officers nodding respectfully as he passed. When he entered the ICU room, he found Officer Singh awake and alert, surrounded by his family. The moment was captured by a single photograph that would later become iconic: Mike, still wearing his work uniform with visible bandages on his hands, standing awkwardly as Mrs. Singh hugged him, while Officer Singh reached out from his hospital bed to grasp Mike's arm. No words were needed to convey the depth of emotion in that room. Officer Singh's eldest daughter, a high school senior, had brought a hand-drawn card signed by her entire class. The youngest, just 6 years old, simply wrapped her arms around Mike's legs and wouldn't let go. "Thank you for saving my papa," she whispered, bringing tears to everyone's eyes. The meeting lasted over an hour, during which Mike learned more about the man he'd saved. Officer Singh had moved to America as a teenager, working his way through college and police academy while supporting his parents. He'd met his wife at a community service event, and together they'd built a life dedicated to helping others. The accident had occurred just 2 weeks before their youngest daughter's birthday party. As Mike left the hospital that evening, he was surprised to find a group of Officer Singh's fellow officers waiting for him. They'd taken up a collection to help repair his truck, which had suffered some heat damage during the rescue. But more than that, they wanted to share what Officer Singh meant to them and the community. Stories poured out about his mentorship, his dedication, and the lives he'd touched over his years of service. The day ended with Mike returning home to find his front yard filled with thank you cards, flowers, and small gifts from community members. Lisa had sorted through them all, saving every note and message. Among them was a crayon drawing from a local kindergarten class showing Mike as a superhero, complete with a cape made from a mechanic's rag. That night, as Mike sat on his porch looking at the stars, his phone buzzed with a text from Officer Singh's wife. She'd sent a photo of her husband sleeping peacefully in his hospital bed, with the simple message, "Our family will never forget what you did. You're part of our family now." Mike showed the message to Lisa, who squeezed his hand gently. Neither of them could have imagined how this one act of courage would ripple out to affect so many lives. But the real surprise, the way this rescue would transform their community and spark a movement of everyday heroes, was still to come. As news helicopters circled overhead and reporters waited patiently for interviews, Mike thought about his father's words from years ago: "Sometimes the biggest changes in life come from the smallest decisions to do what's right." He couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. A week after the rescue, the story had taken on a life of its own. What began as a local news piece had sparked a nationwide conversation about everyday heroes and community bonds. Mike's auto shop had become an unexpected pilgrimage site, with people driving from neighboring states just to shake his hand or get their cars serviced by the hero mechanic. The surveillance camera from a nearby gas station had captured additional footage of the rescue, showing angles that the police dashcam had missed. When this new footage emerged, it revealed just how close Mike had come to losing his own life in those crucial moments. The video showed him stumbling away from the car just seconds before a secondary explosion that could have been fatal. Officer Singh's recovery was progressing well, though doctors insisted he remain in the hospital for observation. His hospital room had transformed into an impromptu community center, with a constant stream of visitors sharing stories about how he'd impacted their lives. Young people from his mentoring program came by to show him their recent report cards or college acceptance letters, proving they'd stayed on the right path even in his absence. The Singh family's youngest daughter had started drawing pictures of 2 superheroes, one in a police uniform and another in mechanic's coveralls. These drawings made their way around the hospital, eventually catching the eye of a children's book publisher who saw something special in the young girl's perspective on the event. Meanwhile, Mike was struggling to balance his newfound fame with his commitment to running the family business. Regular customers worried they'd lose their trusted mechanic to bigger opportunities, but Mike assured them he wasn't going anywhere. "This shop was my father's dream," he'd tell anyone who asked. "No amount of fame could make me leave it behind." The story took an unexpected turn when Mike's father, who'd been in a nursing home recovering from his stroke, saw his son on the news. The excitement of seeing Mike's heroic act sparked something in the elder Chen. His physical therapist reported increased engagement and determination in his rehabilitation exercises. Within days, he was forming complete sentences for the first time in months, desperate to express his pride in his son. Local businesses began putting up signs reading, "Be like Mike," and "Heroes work here," celebrating not just the rescue but the everyday kindness both Mike and Officer Singh had shown their community over the years. The movement spread to neighboring towns, with people sharing their own stories of everyday heroes who'd made a difference in their lives. A local high school teacher used the incident as a starting point for discussions about civic duty and moral courage. Students were particularly moved by learning that both Mike and Officer Singh had immigrant parents who'd taught them the value of community service. The class started a "Hidden Heroes" project, documenting small acts of kindness in their community that often went unnoticed. 3 weeks after the rescue, Officer Singh was finally cleared to return home. The police department organized a small escort for his release from the hospital, but what they didn't expect was the turnout. Hundreds of community members lined the streets, holding signs and cheering as the police cruiser carrying Singh and his family drove past. Mike and Lisa were invited to ride in the procession, their truck now restored to perfect condition thanks to the police department's collection. The procession route took them past Mike's auto shop, where they found something extraordinary. The entire building had been decorated with children's artwork, thank you notes, and photos of both men helping community members over the years. Someone had painted a beautiful mural on the side of the building showing 2 hands clasped together, one in a police uniform sleeve, the other in mechanic's coveralls. That evening, both families gathered for dinner at the Singh home. It was a casual affair, with Mrs. Singh insisting on cooking traditional Indian dishes while Lisa contributed her mother-in-law's famous dumplings. The children played together in the backyard, and the adults shared stories late into the night. What struck everyone was how natural it felt, as if these two families had known each other for years rather than weeks. During dinner, Officer Singh revealed something he hadn't told anyone else. In the moments before the crash, he'd been thinking about retiring from the force. The stress of balancing police work with community outreach had been wearing on him, and he'd wondered if he was really making a difference. But the outpouring of support during his recovery, and seeing how his work had inspired others, had changed his mind completely. Mike shared his own revelation. The accident had reminded him of why his father had started the auto shop in the first place, not just to fix cars, but to help people. Every vehicle that came through their doors represented someone's way to work, to school, to the doctor, or to family. What seemed like simple car repairs were actually keeping the community moving forward. As the evening wound down, Officer Singh's middle child, a quiet boy of 12, asked if he could show Mike something. He led Mike to his room and pulled out a school assignment, an essay titled "My Hero." The boy had written not about his father, as one might expect, but about the partnership between his father and Mike, about how real heroes work together and inspire others to do the same. The boy's essay captured something profound about how the rescue had changed the community. It wasn't just about one dramatic moment of bravery, but about the ripple effects of everyday kindness and courage. The rescue had reminded people that heroes don't wear capes or need special powers, they just need the willingness to help others when the moment calls for it. As Mike and Lisa drove home that night, they passed dozens of "Be like Mike" signs glowing in shop windows. Lisa noticed her husband smiling, something he'd been doing more often lately despite the overwhelming attention. "You know," she said, "your father always said that a mechanic fixes more than just cars. He fixes people's ability to live their lives." Mike nodded, thinking about how a single moment had connected so many lives and stories. But even he couldn't have predicted what would happen next, how this story of a mechanic and a police officer would inspire a movement that would transform not just their community, but communities across the country. The next chapter would prove that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. 1 month after the rescue, the ripple effects of that fateful night continued to spread in unexpected ways. A prominent news magazine had picked up the story, not just focusing on the dramatic rescue, but diving deeper into how it had transformed an entire community. Their coverage caught the attention of a national foundation dedicated to promoting community service and civic engagement. The foundation's representatives arrived in Sacramento with an ambitious proposal. They wanted to use Mike and Officer Singh's story as the cornerstone of a national campaign promoting everyday heroism and community building. The campaign wouldn't just celebrate dramatic rescues, but also the small, daily acts of kindness that both men had demonstrated throughout their lives. Mike's auto shop had become more than just a business, it was now a symbol of community service. Local youth started showing up after school, eager to learn about car repair. Mike found himself teaching basic automotive skills to teenagers who might otherwise have been getting into trouble. Many of these kids were from the same program Officer Singh had started years ago. The shop's walls now displayed not just certification credentials but also letters from people whose lives had been touched by Mike's quiet generosity over the years. One letter was from a single mother who'd been able to keep her job because Mike had fixed her car on credit during tough times. Another came from an elderly veteran whose independence had been preserved thanks to Mike's willingness to make house calls for repairs. Officer Singh's return to active duty was marked by a ceremony that reflected the changed relationship between the police and the community. Instead of a formal police event, it became a neighborhood celebration. Food trucks lined the streets, local musicians performed, and children ran around wearing plastic police badges and mechanics' tool belts. The mayor declared it Community Heroes Day, making it an annual celebration of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The Singh family's youngest daughter's drawings had indeed become a children's book, titled My Two Heroes. The simple story, told through a child's eyes, resonated with families across the country. Schools began using it to teach children about courage, kindness, and the importance of helping others. The book's proceeds went to a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth interested in public service or skilled trades. Mike's father's recovery had progressed remarkably. The nursing home staff credited his improvement to the surge of pride and purpose he felt watching his son's story unfold. He was now able to visit the shop once a week, sitting in his wheelchair near the entrance, greeting customers with a warm smile and occasionally sharing stories about teaching Mike his first repair jobs. The Be Like Mike movement had evolved into something larger. Community groups across the country began organizing Be Like Mike and Raj programs, encouraging partnerships between local businesses and public servants. The idea was simple: when different parts of a community work together, everyone benefits. Local businesses had noticed an interesting trend: people were becoming more willing to help strangers in need. A coffee shop owner reported customers regularly paying for others' orders. A grocery store noticed more people offering to help elderly shoppers carry their bags. The spirit of everyday heroism was becoming contagious. One afternoon, a young woman walked into Mike's shop looking nervous. She explained that she was a former gang member who'd been helped by Officer Singh years ago. Inspired by the rescue story, she decided to start a program teaching basic car maintenance to at-risk youth, hoping to give them marketable skills and a sense of purpose. She wanted Mike's advice on how to get started. This wasn't the only new initiative sparked by their story. Officer Singh's police department had started a community engagement program where officers would partner with local businesses for mentorship opportunities. The program helped break down barriers between law enforcement and the community, especially in neighborhoods where trust had been historically low. The national media attention brought unexpected challenges as well. Both men had to learn to balance their newfound platform with their commitment to their regular duties. They received countless invitations to speak at events and appear on TV shows, but both insisted on maintaining their normal work schedules. Their dedication to their daily responsibilities only enhanced their message about the importance of consistent, everyday service. Lisa had started a blog documenting how the rescue had changed their lives and their community. Her posts revealed the human side of living with sudden fame, the funny moments, the challenging days, and the unexpected blessings. Her honest, down-to-earth writing style resonated with readers, especially when she shared how Mike still insisted on doing household chores despite being called a hero on national television. Mrs. Singh, meanwhile, had become an unofficial ambassador for the growing movement. Her warmth and genuine appreciation for Mike had touched many hearts, and she often spoke at community events about the power of gratitude and connection. She started a support group for families of first responders, creating a space where they could share their fears, hopes, and experiences. The High School Hidden Heroes project had spread to schools nationwide. Students were documenting acts of kindness in their communities, creating a digital archive of everyday heroism. The project was teaching young people that heroic acts weren't just about dramatic rescues, they could be as simple as helping a neighbor, standing up against bullying, or volunteering at a local shelter. As fall approached, Mike and Officer Singh found themselves preparing for their biggest challenge yet. The National Foundation wanted them to help launch a series of community workshops across the country. The workshops would bring together local business owners, first responders, and community members to build stronger relationships and create action plans for community improvement. One evening, as Mike locked up the shop, he found Officer Singh waiting outside. They had developed a habit of taking evening walks together, sharing stories and ideas about their evolving roles in the community. During these walks, they weren't a hero and a cop, they were just two men trying to make sense of how one moment had changed everything. "You know what's funny?" Officer Singh said as they walked. "That night, I thought I was just driving home from another community meeting. You thought you were just driving home from work. Neither of us knew we were driving toward a moment that would change so many lives." Mike nodded, thinking about how ordinary that night had felt until it wasn't. Their story had shown people that extraordinary moments can happen to anyone, at any time. The true measure of a hero isn't in being ready for those big moments, but in how you live all the small moments leading up to them. As autumn leaves began to fall, the story of Mike and Officer Singh entered a new chapter. The National Foundation's workshop program launched in their hometown, serving as a pilot for what would become a nationwide initiative. The first workshop was held in the high school gymnasium, the same place where Officer Singh had coached basketball for underprivileged youth for years. The turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. People from all walks of life filled the gym: small business owners, first responders, teachers, students, and community leaders. What made the workshop unique was its focus on practical, everyday actions rather than grand gestures. Mike and Officer Singh shared their belief that true heroism wasn't about waiting for dramatic moments, but about being ready to help in small ways every day. During one particularly moving session, a local teenager stood up to share how the auto shop apprenticeship program had changed his life. 6 months ago, he'd been on the verge of dropping out of school. Now, he was maintaining a B average and had discovered a passion for mechanical engineering. His story highlighted how one person's willingness to help could redirect an entire life. The workshop's success caught the attention of several major corporations. A national auto parts chain offered to provide tools and equipment to help expand the youth apprenticeship program to other cities. A technology company proposed developing an app that would connect community members with local helpers, from mechanics to first responders to volunteers, creating a network of everyday heroes. Mike's father had progressed enough in his recovery to attend the workshop. Watching from his wheelchair, tears rolled down his cheeks as community members shared stories about his son's impact on their lives. One elderly woman described how Mike had not only fixed her car but had also installed a handrail at her front door after noticing she had trouble with the steps. These small acts of kindness, accumulated over years, painted a picture of quiet heroism that had gone largely unnoticed until now. Officer Singh's police department had begun implementing changes inspired by the workshop. They started a "Coffee with a Cop" program where officers would spend time at local businesses, getting to know community members in casual settings. The program was especially successful at Mike's auto shop, where people felt comfortable sharing their concerns and ideas while waiting for their cars to be serviced. The children's book, My Two Heroes, had sparked a nationwide art contest for elementary school students, asking them to draw their own community heroes. The winning entries would be featured in a follow-up book, celebrating the diverse ways people help their communities. The Singh children had become minor celebrities at their school, proudly sharing how their father and Uncle Mike were changing the world. Lisa's blog had evolved into a popular website chronicling stories of everyday heroes from across the country. She received hundreds of submissions weekly, stories of neighbors helping neighbors, strangers stepping up in times of need, and communities coming together to support one another. The site became a source of inspiration for people looking for ways to make a difference in their own communities. One day, a letter arrived at the auto shop that brought both Mike and Officer Singh to tears. It was from a police officer in Texas who had pulled a teenager from a crashed car, inspired by having watched their story. The officer had remembered Mike's technique of breaking the passenger window and had successfully used it to save the young driver's life. The letter ended with a simple message: "Your story taught me that we're all capable of being heroes when the moment calls for it." The Foundation's research team had begun documenting the ripple effect of the rescue story. They found that communities that had implemented the workshop program showed measurable improvements in various areas: increased volunteerism, stronger relationships between law enforcement and residents, more youth engagement in community service, and even a decrease in juvenile crime rates. Mrs. Singh had turned her support group for first responders' families into a formal organization with chapters in several states. The group provided emotional support, practical assistance, and a sense of community for families dealing with the stress of having loved ones in dangerous professions. She often reminded members that heroes aren't just the ones who wear uniforms, they're also the families who support them. The national tour began in Chicago on a snowy January morning. Mike and Officer Singh found themselves standing before a packed auditorium of police officers, firefighters, small business owners, and community leaders. The nervousness they'd felt melted away as they began sharing their story, not as heroes, but as ordinary people who discovered the extraordinary impact of simple choices. Back home, their families had created a support system to keep both men's regular work going. Lisa managed the auto shop's appointments with help from two new mechanics Mike had trained through the youth program. Mrs. Singh coordinated with the police department to ensure her husband's community programs continued running smoothly. The families had grown so close that they shared Sunday dinners, alternating between homes and cooking traditions. The tour revealed something unexpected: every city had its own Mike and Officer Singh, ordinary people quietly making extraordinary differences in their communities. In Detroit, they met a baker who'd turned his shop into a youth training center. In Houston, a retired teacher had created a network of volunteer tutors. In Atlanta, a taxi driver had organized a free ride service for elderly medical appointments. These stories became part of their workshops, proving that heroism wasn't about one dramatic moment but about consistent, daily choices to help others. The Foundation documented these stories, creating a growing archive of everyday heroes that inspired others to take action in their own communities. One particularly memorable workshop in Miami featured a surprise guest, the Texas police officer who'd used Mike's rescue technique. He brought with him the teenager he'd saved and the boy's family. Their emotional reunion brought the entire audience to tears and demonstrated the ripple effect of knowledge shared and courage inspired. The media coverage of the tour took an unexpected turn when a documentary filmmaker began following their journey. Instead of focusing on the dramatic rescue, she captured the quiet moments: Mike teaching a young apprentice how to diagnose an engine problem over video chat, Officer Singh calling his kids every night to help with homework, both men sharing meals with local community leaders and hearing their stories. Meanwhile, back in Sacramento, the impact of their work continued to grow. The auto shop apprenticeship program had expanded to 5 locations, with local business owners stepping up to mentor young people. The police department's community engagement program had become a model for other cities, with officers and business owners working together to create safe spaces for youth activities. Mike's father's recovery had progressed to the point where he could spend half-days at the original shop, sharing wisdom with the apprentices and keeping the books. His presence helped maintain the shop's family atmosphere even when Mike was away. Regular customers said the shop felt like a community center where people came not just to fix their cars but to connect with neighbors. The Singh children had started their own initiatives. The eldest had created a peer mentoring program at her high school, matching seniors with freshmen to help them navigate their first year. The middle child had organized a junior police community liaison group, bringing together kids from different backgrounds to discuss neighborhood issues. The youngest continued drawing, her art now decorating the walls of several community centers. Lisa's website had grown into a full-fledged platform for community organizing, helping people connect with local initiatives and share resources. She'd added a section specifically for small business owners looking to implement community service programs, featuring practical advice and success stories from across the country. During their stop in Seattle, Mike and Officer Singh received news that touched them deeply. Their hometown had voted to convert an abandoned warehouse near the auto shop into a community center. The center would house an expanded youth apprenticeship program, a police community outreach office, and meeting spaces for various community groups. The building would be named The Bridge, symbolizing the connections their story had helped create. The tour also brought challenges. Both men missed their families terribly, and the constant travel was exhausting. Yet every city brought new inspiration. In Boston, they met a group of former gang members who'd started a conflict resolution program. In Minneapolis, a network of food truck owners had created a mobile soup kitchen system. Each story reinforced their belief in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. One evening, after a particularly moving workshop in Denver, Mike received a video call from one of his original apprentices. The young man had just been accepted to engineering school with a full scholarship. He thanked Mike for showing him that his life could be about more than just fixing cars, it could be about fixing his community. Officer Singh's police department had reported a significant drop in juvenile crime rates and an increase in community cooperation. Other departments were sending officers to learn from their approach, creating a network of law enforcement professionals committed to community-centered policing. The children's book series had expanded to include stories from different cities, each featuring local heroes making a difference in their communities. Schools were using the books to teach civic responsibility and empathy, helping children understand that they didn't need special powers to be heroes. As the tour entered its final weeks, Mike and Officer Singh found themselves reflecting on how far they'd come from that fiery night on a dark road. Their story had sparked a movement, but the real success wasn't in the big numbers or national attention, it was in the countless small changes happening in communities across the country. During their last workshop in New York City, a young auto mechanic raised his hand during the Q&A session. "I always thought being a hero meant doing something big and dramatic," he said. "But you've shown us that real heroism is about showing up every day, ready to help however we can. How do you keep that spirit alive when the excitement fades?" Mike and Officer Singh exchanged glances, and Officer Singh spoke first. "The excitement is in the results," he said. "Every time you see a young person choose a better path, every time a neighbor helps a neighbor, every time a community comes together to solve a problem, that's the real excitement. The rescue was just one moment. The real story is what happens every day after." Returning home after the national tour felt like stepping into a changed world. Spring had arrived in Sacramento, bringing new life to the Bridge Community Center, which was nearing completion. The old warehouse had been transformed into a vibrant hub of activity, its walls adorned with murals depicting scenes of community service and cooperation. The documentary about their journey was in final editing, but early screenings had revealed something unexpected. While Mike and Officer Singh's story remained the heart of the film, it had captured a larger narrative about the changing face of American communities. Viewers were particularly moved by the stories of people in different cities who'd been inspired to take action in their own neighborhoods. One morning, as Mike arrived at his shop, he found an unusual scene. A group of auto shop owners from across the state had gathered, wanting to learn how to implement their own youth apprenticeship programs. What struck Mike most was seeing some of his former apprentices among them, now successful mechanics themselves, eager to pass on what they'd learned to a new generation. Officer Singh's return to regular police work brought its own surprises. His approach to community policing had been so successful that the State Police Academy invited him to help develop a new training curriculum. The focus would be on building relationships within communities before crises occurred, using the principles they'd shared during their workshop tour. The Singh family's youngest daughter's art had inspired a new project at the bridge. Children from the community were creating a massive mosaic on one of the interior walls, each piece representing a different act of kindness they'd witnessed or performed. The project became a visual representation of how small actions could create something beautiful and meaningful when brought together. Lisa's community organizing platform had evolved into a national network, connecting people and resources across the country. She discovered that many communities faced similar challenges, and solutions that worked in one place could often be adapted to help another. The platform now included training materials, success stories, and a mentorship program linking experienced community organizers with newcomers. Mike's father had made enough progress in his recovery to spend full days at the shop again. His presence brought a sense of continuity to their expanding operation, reminding everyone that the shop's commitment to community service had deep roots. He'd started teaching a weekend class for senior citizens about basic car maintenance, helping them maintain their independence while building new social connections. The police department's community engagement programs had produced remarkable results. Youth participation in after-school activities had increased significantly, while reports of vandalism and petty crime had decreased. Other departments sent observers to learn from their success, leading to a regional network of community-oriented police programs. One day, a letter arrived that deeply moved both families. It was from a small town in Idaho, where a local mechanic and police officer had worked together to create their own version of the bridge. They'd adapted the program to fit their community's needs, focusing on agricultural education alongside automotive training. The letter included photos of their newly opened center and stories of lives already being changed. The Foundation's research team had completed their first comprehensive study of the movement's impact. The results were compelling. Communities that had implemented similar programs showed significant improvements in various metrics of social health and community engagement. But more importantly, they found countless personal stories of lives transformed through small acts of kindness and connection. Mrs. Singh's support group for first responders' families had grown into a national organization, with chapters in every state. They'd recently launched a scholarship program for children of first responders, named in honor of Mike's father, celebrating both the sacrifice of emergency workers and the importance of skilled trades in building strong communities. The auto shop apprenticeship program had achieved an unexpected milestone, their first international student. A young mechanic from Japan had come to learn not just about fixing cars, but about building community through business. He planned to take the model back to his hometown, adapting it to fit his own culture's needs and traditions. The children's book series had spawned a popular animated web series, reaching even more young people with its message about everyday heroism. Each episode featured real stories from different communities, showing children that heroes could be found everywhere, doing all kinds of work to help others. One evening, as both families gathered for their weekly dinner, they received news that would take their mission in an unexpected direction. A major philanthropic organization wanted to establish a national network of community centers based on the bridge model. They would provide funding and resources, but they wanted Mike and Officer Singh to help develop the program guidelines and training materials. The prospect was both exciting and daunting. They'd need to find a way to maintain the personal, grassroots nature of their work while scaling it to a national level. As they discussed the opportunity, Mike's father reminded them of something important. The reason this works is because it's built on real relationships and genuine care. That can't be mass-produced, but it can be inspired. The documentary filmmaker, who'd been capturing periodic updates since the tour, noted a subtle but significant change in how people spoke about community service. Instead of seeing it as something extra, something done when convenient, people had begun treating it as an integral part of daily life. The film's working title had evolved from The Hero Mechanic to Everyone's Story, reflecting this broader understanding. As spring turned to early summer, the bridge prepared for its grand opening. The event would bring together people from across the country who'd been part of their journey: apprentices, police officers, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who'd found their own ways to make a difference. But perhaps most meaningfully, it would include many of the regular customers from Mike's shop and residents from Officer Singh's beat who'd known them long before they became national figures. The night before the opening, Mike and Officer Singh took their traditional evening walk, passing the garden where the accident had occurred. The plants were in full bloom now, and the bench had become a favorite spot for neighbors to gather and chat. They sat for a while, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "Sometimes I wonder," Officer Singh said, "what would have happened if I'd taken a different route home that night? Or if you'd left work a few minutes later?" Mike smiled, understanding the weight of those what-ifs. "I think someone else would have stopped to help," he replied. "Maybe differently, maybe with different results. But I believe good people will always step up when needed. We just happened to be the ones there that night." As they walked back, they passed several of the new community initiatives their story had inspired: a youth-run coffee shop, a senior citizens computer class, a community garden. Each project represented not just a program or service, but a web of relationships and connections that made their community stronger. Neither man could have predicted how saving a life would lead to saving something larger, the sense of connection and purpose that makes a community thrive. As they prepared for the next chapter of their journey, they understood that their story's real power wasn't in its dramatic beginning, but in how it had shown people that everyone has the potential to make a difference, one small choice at a time. The grand opening of the bridge drew thousands of people on a bright summer morning. The old warehouse had been transformed into something remarkable, not just a building, but a symbol of what communities could achieve together. The line of visitors stretched around the block, each person eager to be part of this historic moment. Mayor Chen, no relation to Mike, stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered for the ceremony. "1 year ago," she began, "a split-second decision on a dark road changed our community forever. But the real miracle wasn't just the rescue, it was what happened afterward, how one act of courage inspired thousands more." The documentary about their journey premiered that evening on the building's outdoor wall. Families spread blankets on the lawn, sharing food and stories as they watched. The film captured not just the dramatic rescue and its aftermath, but the quiet moments that had truly transformed their community: apprentices learning their first repair jobs, police officers playing basketball with neighborhood kids, elderly residents teaching cooking classes, and countless small acts of kindness that had become everyday occurrences. During the screening, Mike noticed something remarkable. When the rescue scene played, people weren't focused on the drama of the moment. Instead, they were pointing out familiar faces in the crowd scenes, recognizing neighbors and friends who'd been inspired to start their own community initiatives. The story had become bigger than just two men, it belonged to everyone now. Officer Singh's police department had experienced its own transformation. The number of community volunteers had grown so large that they'd created a formal civilian advisory board to help coordinate various programs. Crime rates had dropped significantly, but more importantly, the relationship between police and residents had fundamentally changed. Officers were now seen as part of the community fabric, not just authority figures. The auto shop apprenticeship program had graduated its 100th student. These graduates weren't just skilled mechanics, they'd become community leaders in their own right. Many had started their own businesses, always with a focus on giving back. The program had created a network of auto shops across the country, all committed to the idea that fixing cars could be a way to help fix communities. Mike's father, now fully recovered, had become a beloved figure at the bridge. He'd started a mentorship program connecting elderly skilled workers with young apprentices, bridging generations through shared knowledge. His presence reminded everyone that wisdom and experience were valuable resources that shouldn't be wasted. The Singh children had grown into their own roles as community leaders. The eldest was heading to college on a public service scholarship, planning to study urban development. The middle child had created a youth council that was being replicated in other cities. The youngest's art therapy program had become an integral part of the bridge's services, helping people express their hopes for their communities through creativity. Lisa's community organizing platform had evolved into something unexpected, a think tank for grassroots community development. Universities were studying their model of organic community growth, trying to understand how small actions could create such significant social change. She'd recently been invited to speak at several international conferences about the power of local connections in solving global challenges. Mrs. Singh's support network for first responders' families had made an important discovery. When emergency workers felt supported by their communities, they were better able to provide support in return. The program had expanded to include mental health services, child care assistance, and emergency support systems, all built on the principle that those who help others sometimes need help themselves. The national network of community centers inspired by the bridge was taking shape, but with an important twist. Rather than creating identical programs everywhere, each center was encouraged to adapt the model to fit their local needs and culture. Some focused on technical training, others on arts and culture, but all maintained the core principle of building connections through service. 1 year after the rescue, the Foundation's research team published their findings in a major social policy journal. They documented something remarkable. Communities that had implemented similar programs showed measurable improvements not just in crime rates and economic indicators, but in mental health outcomes, educational achievement, and overall life satisfaction. The secret wasn't in any particular program, but in the web of relationships these initiatives helped create. During the grand opening celebrations, Mike and Officer Singh found a quiet moment to visit the garden where their story had begun. The bench was occupied by an elderly woman teaching a young girl how to plant flowers, a small moment of connection that represented everything they'd been working toward. As they watched the sunset from the bridge's rooftop garden, surrounded by their families and closest supporters, Officer Singh's youngest daughter tugged on Mike's sleeve. "Uncle Mike," she said, holding up her latest drawing, "I drew what heroes really look like." The picture showed not dramatic rescues or heroic poses, but simple scenes of people helping people, a mechanic teaching a teenager, a police officer helping a lost child, neighbors sharing a meal. The documentary ended with a sequence that captured the essence of their journey. It showed ordinary moments from communities across the country, a teenage apprentice completing her first solo repair job, a former gang member mentoring at-risk youth, a police officer attending a community cookout, elderly residents teaching traditional crafts to children. The final shot panned out to show thousands of these moments happening simultaneously, creating a tapestry of everyday heroism. As the credits rolled and people began to disperse, Mike and Officer Singh stayed behind to help clean up, a small act that reminded everyone that true leadership is about service, not recognition. Their families joined in, working alongside community members who'd stopped to help, turning even this mundane task into a moment of connection. Later that night, as both families gathered for a quiet celebration at the Chen home, Mike's father raised his glass for a toast. "When I opened this shop 30 years ago," he said, "I thought I was just creating a business. But my son showed me that we were really creating a way to connect with our community. Every car we fixed was a family we helped, every apprentice we trained was a life we touched." Officer Singh added his own thoughts. "A year ago, I was saved by a stranger who became a brother. But the real miracle wasn't the rescue, it was discovering that every community is full of heroes just waiting for their moment to help. Sometimes they just need to be reminded that they have that power." As the evening wound down, Mike and Officer Singh took one last walk through their transformed neighborhood. The streets that had once been empty after dark were now alive with community activities. The bridge's lights glowed in the distance, a beacon of hope and possibility. "You know what I've learned?" Mike said as they walked. "Heroes aren't made in big moments. They're made in all the small moments leading up to them. Every time we choose to help, to teach, to listen, to care, that's what makes us ready for those bigger moments when they come." Officer Singh nodded, understanding. "And the real heroes aren't just the ones who make the news," he added. "They're the ones who show up every day, making their corner of the world a little better, one small act at a time." As they turned toward home, they passed dozens of people whose lives had been touched by their story, not through the dramatic rescue, but through the quiet revolution of kindness and connection it had inspired. Their legacy wasn't just in the programs they'd created or the lives they'd changed, but in the reminder that every person has the power to make a difference, and every community has the potential to transform itself through small acts of everyday heroism.